Hello and welcome to Your Story and Awesome Builder Sessions. This is Sumir and I'm a solution architect with AWS based out in Bangalore and primarily working with startups. Today we have Sridhar and Amit joining us from Cryo.2. So Cryo is an experiential learning platform for developers, and today we are going to talk about how their journey and how their journey took and some of their product and technology reflections. Sridhar, co-founder of the company, has previously worked with Google and NetApp and is a techie by heart. He has worked across kernel and distributed systems as well. Amit, one of the founding members at Cryo, heads the product design at Cryo and has previously worked with companies like Flipkart and DShaw and is a designer by heart. So before we get started with the discussion, I wanted to set the agenda right? Before we have the discussion. Can we move to the agenda slide? All right. So in the session, we are going to talk about Cryo's introduction to product and technology reflections based on their journey, and then we'll move into what to build, and basically this will go into 3 different segments, and then we'll move into how to build such kind of stacks, and we will go in deep dive into more technical things there, and then from there on we'll move into the key takeaways from the session, and then finally into Q&A where you can ask questions in the forum, and then we'll ask those questions with the founders here. So with that, I would like to invite Sridhar Jayachandran to share his experience. Sridhar is a Cryo co-founder here. Sridhar.
Thanks, Sumir. Very good morning to all, and thanks to Your Story and AWS for hosting us. I'm Sridhar, one of the co-founders of Cryo. Today, I'd like to walk you through our journey of building Cryo and some of the hits and misses that we have been going through in the past year and a half to 2 years. And I hope some of those insights are useful to you as well. All right, before we get started, it would be useful to kind of quickly set some context on what we are doing at Cryo and why we started Cryo, right? I think one problem that all of us can definitely resonate with is the quality of talent in Indian market, right? In terms of the engineering talent, there are lots of graduates coming out of college every year, about 8 lakh every year. And most of them have aspirations to move into tech industry, right? With that given, the quality of these people, the kind of opportunities that they get, etc., is not really that great. And this is a problem that we wanted to solve. And we started with like asking ourselves few questions, going deep, talking to a lot of users, understanding what the challenges are. And we started off with a dream, right? Always that's going to be the way startups get built. So hypothetically speaking, what if every developer in the world, right, gets to intern with a top-notch company, right? The kind of experience that they get, the independent problem-solving skills that they would actually get, the kind of learning that happens, right? They're trying to solve a problem, a business problem usually, and then when they solve that, they learn the tech along with that, right? The contextual learning that happens at that point, the kind of tools and technologies that they get exposed to. It's really insane, right? Even if it's for a short period, the internship definitely helps them learn things really fast. Now, what if every individual gets this kind of learning opportunity as such, right? So you know that reality is far, far away from it, right? If you think of how developers learn tech today, it's mostly through lectures, a lot of videos these days for sure, right? And hands-on tutorials have also taken up quite a bit in the last few years. In the last like decade or so, nothing much has changed per se, right? One thing that has changed quite a bit is improved access. For example, you can sit here, listen to MIT professors say talk on data structures, or somebody talking about system design, but that's in terms of access to high quality content, right? In terms of the pedagogy or the way people learn, etc., has not really changed for masses, right? Now, if you want to also think about it, most of the tech learning for like early engineers start once they join work. Why is it still the case, right? Why is tech learning outside of work still not that great, right? We actually went very deep into it, trying to understand what exactly happens at work, right? That actually helps people learn much faster and then also learn in a great way in terms of the internalization that people get with good mentors around, etc. What is that exactly that's happening? We started dissecting that into smaller pieces. What we found out was There were analogies similar in other domains. For example, if we were to take business, right, management studies, Harvard Business Cases has completely changed the way people learn management, right? It happened a century ago, right? Somewhere around 1920, this happened. And then 80% of the business schools use Harvard Business Cases to actually teach business, right? It's a flipped learning where it is completely active. Now that's where we thought, okay, hey, what if we were to build such a platform where people get work-like experiential learning, right, at scale, leveraging all the deep tech data and some of the levers with more learning, right, like the deep learning sciences. That's where we started, and here we go. We have micro experiences. The premise is very simple with micro experience. What the developers do over here is they take the avatar of a developer in a specific company, right? And whatever learning experience that the developer would go through in that company, they go through the same learning journey, right? For example, the user could actually take the role of a developer in Uber, right? Which is Curate. It's kind of like a mock Uber, right? And then whatever the developer would go through in Uber day to day, the same kind of experience the user goes through on our platform. I'll help understand this a bit better with an example. So in terms of how people learn on our platform, they take the avatar of a developer. Let's take an example of a developer joining a company like Swiggy called QEats. Okay, the person joins as a backend engineer. Now he's one of the very few engineers. It's the early days, right? Maybe about 10, 15 engineers might have been there. The marketing team decides to do some acquisition campaign, right? As with any other company, they want a lot of users. So what they do is they try to run a campaign between 8 to 10 p.m. every day. They would actually serve users like 50% discount. Suddenly the idea was to actually get the number of app installs to a higher number, right? But unfortunately, what they're seeing is a reversal in trend in QEats. So the marketing team is working with the developer and they're trying to understand, okay, what is exactly happening? As you can see, this is just like you have a simulation here where it loads, the screen used to load in say 1 second, the home screen loads in 1 second, but with load between 8 to 10 p.m., it is taking more than 11 seconds to load, because of which people are uninstalling the app. So if you were the developer, what would you go about doing that, right? You're not going to just like throw systems at it. That's not the right way to solve the problem. So you would actually go through understanding which area is the bottleneck. Is it the load balancer? Is it the API gateway? You will just like go through individual layers on your platform, understand where exactly the bottleneck is. And in this case, it was a DB overload. So they started using Redis and then solve the problem. And this is exactly how a developer on our platform learns. And which is very similar to how a developer in a company like Swiggy would also learn, right? So the takeaways are really deep. And one exercise I have for you is just like go search for a tutorial on Redis and see what you find on internet. Then you would be able to contrast the learning methodology on Cryo versus what you actually would get in general with a tutorial. All right. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Amit, who's going to talk about our reflections in terms of how we decided what to build. Right? It's a very, very critical decision, and it's actually a series of decisions that a startup has to take, because otherwise you could be building something that nobody wants. Okay, over to Amit.
Hey, thanks, Sridhar. Hi, everyone. I'm Amit, one of the founding members of Cryo.do, and I look after product and design in Cryo. So we basically Cryo is like a typical startup. Like we are marching towards like a big vision with a need for a faster product market fit, and we just like any other startup, we have like limited resources. So in last 1.5 years of our journey, like we have been posed with various challenges, and I want to talk about, like how did we actually enable ourselves and taking decision in terms of, like what sort of products do we need to build, and like where should most of our journey actually, most of our energy should be invested. So I'm going to talk about these 3 points, and let's dive into it. One of the key important point, which comes in deciding what needs to be built is the feedback cycle. Like how faster, how quicker, and how frequently are you actually capturing feedback from the user. So I'll actually go, back few months, like August 2019, and this is how our product used to look. Like it was just, an interface with bunch of, like task and a micro experiences given for a user. And most of our experience was, like very fragmented. This was the time when we were actually doing, like learning cohorts for product companies, and our iteration cycles were a bit slower, and the feedback that we were getting from users was, like much slower. The experience, like user had to look at our product, then they used to go to virtual machine to, like code. This was a separate environment, and then, there will be assessment reports, whatever code that they are writing, we will be actually sending them in their Gmail. And to orchestrate all of these things at that time, we used to have, like long PPTs where we will actually give them step by step. Now, this was also the time, like when Cryo was trying to figure out what a user offering is going to be for the end developer. So that actually forced us, to get into very faster feedback cycles. And what we did was, a vision towards creating like a unified experience by, like forcing ourselves into going into faster feedback cycles. So every weekend we used to conduct, these cohorts or experiments in colleges. We aligned like 35 campuses. Our release cycle of product also was mapped with like a weekly feedback cycle that we were getting for user, with a single aim of actually focusing on user pain. And this is how like our fragmented experience that I actually just walked you through transformed into a unified one that you see on the right hand side, with tasks appearing like a very defined modules and milestone, like an integrated development environment inside the browser itself, rather than having to log in into like a remote desktop machine. The assessment actually also came in the product, and like rather than those elaborate PPTs where we used to tell them you have to go here and there, we created like inbuilt guided journeys. So like it's very important how do we actually force ourselves into like this faster feedback cycle, so that your product can actually mature much faster and you can do much faster iteration. And it is one of the most important things, like when it comes to deciding what is it that you want to build. One of the next things or the key tenet also in terms of deciding what needs to be built is running a lot of experiments, because we are connecting a lot of feedback from users. Now that feedback actually needs to translate into like eventual product, but we can't go to investing all our energy into that final product. So how do we do it? Like we will have a bunch of hypotheses, like that we have got from our feedback from the users. Then we run like bunch of experiments, and then based on the result like we iterate over it. So I'm gonna take like few examples. Like one of the key thing that was happening earlier when we were conducting those in class learnings, like there was a lack of a lot of motivation for users, but we also didn't know like what will actually motivate our users. What we did was like put like a very simple tracker in a PPT slide, and we started projecting it. And then that actually we saw a lot of motivation in user. They wanted to see their name on the board. So with just very low cost utility, like sort of experiment, we were able to see that there is some potential in this hypothesis. This eventually got turned into like us creating a very very hacky solution, which was powered just through Excel sheets. Still we haven't invested in the full DB and like whole of backend, but just a Python script which reads from an Excel sheet and creates for a user a dashboard which gives them. And like this is still like in progress. We are still learning from it. Like we are trying to see how can we give them more and more details about like where they are in their journey, and what sort of engagement levels that we can have where we can motivate them even further. So like this was one of the things. Like one more key important thing in Cryo is like how much help actually a user is getting on a platform. And it's so difficult like figure out what is that one medium through which we can actually help our end users to make progress in their journeys. We ran like a lot of experiments there. Like there were a bunch of FAQ docs that we had created which people can refer to. Then we created like the Zendesk sort of static FAQs. We actually created like a collaborative forum where people can answer each other questions, like mentors can answer their questions. Then we, like had like a very, very personalized sort of one-on-one attention on Slack, and we experiment with a lot of these things. And, like after running these things, that's when we created a hypothesis. Yes, this help is a very important part which needs to, like come on the product for it to scalably solve for the user. And that's when, like, that's how the scalable help actually came on our product. So, like experiments, I think like are based on the feedback that you are gathering from the users. The experiment, the faster experiments that you can run, more experiments that you can run, like more you can actually improve your products and decide, like what is it that you should be investing your energies into. And the best thing about experiments is, like you never have to worry about whether it'll pass or fail, because pass or fail in both the cases, it's always a win-win situation. And then the third most important thing that I feel, like which can actually help a team decide, like where they should actually invest their energies, is to actually build a product mindset in your org. It's not just a product functions responsibility, but it's like everyone's, like right from engineers, designer, operation guide, everyone actually having that mindset of, like trying to figure out where the user pain is going to prioritize a lot of things for us in terms of, like how we are going to actually build it, like awareness. One of the key things that we did for that was our engineers were actually, like were the on-call for the products that they are actually coding for. They are also interfacing with users whenever they are facing any issues with the problem. It's like eating your own dog food, right? Like, and then we also conduct, like weekly pulse surveys, just so we are able to empathize with the user. There are a lot of, like features that we have actually have in our product which got prioritized because of these surveys, where, like user actually would complain about, like certain things. We'll also get, like a lot of positive feedback about the products that you are building, where you are doing good and where you are doing bad. So this is about, like how can we collect some of the feedback. But the one more important thing is, like how this actually led into, like the organic product growth for Cryo. Basically, like each of our individual like engineers are motivated to, like try to create a solution which will actually ease the pain. For example, like that virtual machine to, like inbuilt editor sort of a feature was actually started with, like something on a WhatsApp. And then, like engineers are conducting, like pulse surveys regarding their own product areas along with people, like where is it, the people are facing problem, what is happening, what is not happening, and then they are prioritizing for their product areas. And, like whenever that's we are delivering also, and then like keeping very close loop with the users in terms of telling them, like the products that you are requesting or the features that you are requesting, you are able to actually like deliver on that. And that creates, like sort of this flywheel where you have like constant connect with like your user, your engineers and your teams are able to actually create like this great empathy towards them, and then that's how they are able to like prioritize some of these features. Yeah. So like in terms of if I were to, like summarize this whole thing, like forcing yourself into a very fast feedback cycle, and keeping finding ways to, like experiment despite your low budget. And, like a team with a product mindset can actually lead to organic growth. And, like this is what will actually give you the most understanding about what needs to be built and where you should actually, like invest your energies. Yeah. Yeah. So I now after, like you decide what to build, like how do you actually go about building that thing?
Hey, Amit, sorry, I went on, I was on mute while I was asking a question. Sorry, so Amit, before you move on, I have a couple of questions, for you before you start. So first is, how do you collect the user feedback exactly, right? And second is basically, how do you decide which experiments you should be, investing into?
Oh, yeah, sure. Very good question, actually. So, see, to collect feedback, right? Like early on, as a startup, we actually focused a lot on, like observing our users, because we were conducting these, like in-campus drives and, like in companies, we actually observed a lot, like looking at how users are using your product, like live, can actually give you a lot more insight into where the problems are happening. Now, this was, the focus was more on qualitative and, but then we also had, like a continuous feedback cycle, as I was mentioning earlier also, like weekly pulse surveys or, like on call from engineers. Like that is, I think, like the main source of feedback for us. So this is how we go about, like collecting those feedback, focusing on observation. One thing that we don't do enough today, I would say, is, like quantitative one. As we move forward, like we should be able to run a lot of A/B tests and, like collect a lot of a lot of quantitative data so that we know where exactly the problems are happening, and then like back it up with again qualitative so that proper user behaviors are being designed and catered to. And the other question about your experiment, right? Like, see, experiments are a bunch of hypotheses. Like you have hypotheses in terms of, like sometimes you have a very strong hypothesis on something, and sometimes your feedback will actually tell you, like what are the experiments that you should be running. So you take those hypotheses and then, how do you decide which experiment? That's very easy because you're a startup, you're short on resources, you're short on money. So whatever can give you, like quicker results in terms of, your hypothesis validation, like that's how you will prioritize.
Yeah, thanks, Amit.
Point that I want to add there is like in the beginning, right? You have access to users. If your company can actually get access to users, qualitative research is actually much more powerful because you get to see users, right? Sometimes things might get missed out in quantitative feedback where you look at data and then try to interpret. Qualitative feedback is very, very on your face most of the times. So it's extremely useful because you would be able to pick very subtle hints from the user, right? So it's going to be very useful in that way.
Right. So yeah, I think like from this is what I had from in terms of like how do you prioritize about what needs to be built. Now there are a lot of choices that you have to make when it comes to how do you build. So I will let Sridhar actually talk about those things.
Sure. Thanks, Amit. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to give you a sense of having decided what to build. What are the choices and our learnings in terms of how we went about it, right? They're all our own takeaways. Some of them are actually still, it's a continuous process, right? You learn something, you try to apply it in your next iteration, fix things, move on, right? So these are at least some of the top points that we thought it would be useful to share. The first and foremost is, do you have to look for, I think this is actually a very, very common question for a lot of people, right? Do you build capabilities or do you build features? Right, it's a very there's a vast difference in a lot of cases. So what do you start with? Over here we had like three to four factors that usually helps us with in making a choice. And start with the first one is like, what is it? Do you know that whatever you are building is something that is core part of what you are building overall, your product, or does it require more validation? Right, this is the first and foremost thing that you have to understand. I'll just like explain some of these with some examples from our case. The first thing is that we know that we are actually building an education platform, right? And if you have to think of any education platform, you can take books like other platforms, video platforms out there. Typically, there are some courses and then there are some list of modules or some chapters you could say in book that are out there. And we know for sure when we start the company that if you're building a learning platform, we'll definitely have some kind of organization very similar to this. There may be things here and there, but we know that we need to have some courses and then we need to have some sort of a chapter kind of concept. So given that it is core capability, we spend quite a bit of time in investing in capability itself. Like we spent a lot of time doing a lot of entity modeling, understanding how the interactions need to be between these chapters and the courses. We did quite a bit of investments. I would say 2 months of investment in building something reasonably over here so that it is going to come forward for our entire, like say 1 to 2 years, right? Ban to start with, so that we don't have to keep changing them. So here investment made sense. I'll also show a different example where we know that when people learn, orchestration plays a very important role, right? When you give what, how they go about doing things, that kind of an orchestration, right? And if you have to think of a company, you have Jira tickets, etc., where somebody assigns you work, some deadlines, and then you keep doing it, right? that orchestration has a huge value, something we know from work, but does it have the same impact on a casual learner, right? That's kind of one of our top questions. So we didn't have enough conviction, though our hypothesis and gut feel said that it will have an impact. So instead of going and building capability out for this, what we started off was with something very, very simple, right? We started off with Google Docs, where we had a bunch of tasks that users can go through on the platform. And then we took out off-the-shelf solutions, right? GitLab actually provides you solutions where you can have something very similar to Jira board and anybody can use it, right? Open source softwares that are available, we integrated with them. It's not a whole lot of engineering effort, but it still gave us whatever we wanted in terms of the capabilities. Once we were completely sure, right, that this is the right direction and orchestration is going to help a long way in terms of driving learning outcome, only then we actually invested a lot in engineering, right? Here, engine investment was very heavy, and given that we know that it's going to come a long way, we spent quite a bit of time on this, and then we actually built this. We made this investment. Now the next question is, okay, we know, okay, that core capabilities need to be built, something that needs user validation. You have to probably experiment before making large investment. Now, the next important factor is, are you going in the right direction? Do you know that the product is heading in the direction, or the feature is heading in the right direction for you to make a lot of investment? I'll just continue with the same example that I showed in the last slide, where we had these tasks which we know at some point in time are going to be extremely useful in driving learning outcome. So we have enough conviction. The question is, maybe there may be iterative changes based on user feedback, but in terms of the feature, the capability itself, we know for sure this is something we need in the platform, right? The whole orchestration. So after having reasonable conviction, we did multi-month effort to make sure that we are forward provisioning on this particular area in the engineering. Right now, if you provision it in this way, right, once you know for sure that you are going to go in this direction, there's also a flip side, right? Most of the times things could work out, but sometimes if you make multi-month investment upfront, right, if your business or product strategy changes for some reason, right? For example, a lot of companies have probably done something because of COVID. You can't anticipate external factors. Sometimes when you have to do that, or based on some experiment, you have to suddenly shift strategy. Sometimes these things might go waste. This is where your gut feel and then the kind of how objectively are you able to take some decision comes into picture, right? But with reasonable conviction, if you think that directionally what you are doing is correct, it is good to actually invest a bit upfront so that you can build features faster at that point, right? Instead of building features individually, which will take a lot of effort, building some capability makes sense at that point. I take one other example where we actually didn't know how things will change based on user feedback, right? Here we wanted to engage with users, make sure that they are actually excited about the platform, they engage with us on a day-to-day basis. In that case, we don't know how to engage, right? What to send them. Should we use WhatsApp or Slack or email? Do we DM them? Do we broadcast them? Right? What time of day do we send? When we have no idea about user engagement, right, in this particular context, instead of building a beast, right, in engineering, we instead went for slightly easier solutions. We just built certain things where our cryo team would say, send something to the user at 8 p.m. every day, right? It helped us actually validate some of it and also understand, are we actually going in the right direction? Which effort is giving more rewards, right? And then based on that, we were able to adjust our tech investments as well. Right. The next thing is how easy is to actually reverse your decision, right? That's going to be an important factor as well. Here, one of the key questions that we asked ourselves is, can we actually architecturally lay our blocks, right, as separate pieces and then have a loosely coupled system? If this works for you, then it's much easier for you to change things on the run. Then it means that you can build for now, features for now, because you are only focusing on one architectural block, build something, make sure that it works end to end, and then you don't really have to care about the localized implementation of that particular architectural block, because you know that once you gain enough confidence, once you understand the use cases really well, you can always go ahead and then build that particular architectural block. For the number of user flows we have, right, we have a very high number of Kafka topics. We have about 75 plus Kafka topics, and this has definitely helped us by keeping things loose. we were able to iterate much faster. And also the extra benefit that you get with loose coupling is that failure handling is much simpler. Right? So this is one of our takeaways. So if you can lay down your architectural block and have loose coupling, changing became much easier. So this kind of a common thing, right? You have to take decisions every other day if you're running a startup, right? You always have, and you don't have all the information upfront. That is actually the critical thing. If you have every single factor that is going to affect your decision upfront, yeah, you can always make the right decision, but that's not going to be the case. So there are few choices that we have made, and then we considered few factors before making those choices. Thought there'd be some interesting takeaways here as well. So deciding on the tech stack, what is the most critical factor, right? You can choose to write, we have a typical REST API backend. We could have chosen to write it in Go. We could have chosen to write it in Java, Python, right? So the biggest factor we learned, and it was slightly a painful learning as well, was access to experts. You don't have 10 experts in your team, right? You're going to have a very lean team. So it is very critical that you can actually dip into your network and then ask people whenever you have issues. Now we started off with Python, and this is how it started. We'll just like ping our friends in our network and say, okay, hey, how do you write integration tests in Python? So somebody replies, yeah, it's simple, dude. Why don't you actually go write something in JUnit and test in JNN? I know that it works in Java. Python should have something similar. Okay. And then again, that's after a few days, we have same thing, right? It's not, Python is not strongly typed. There's something that they have introduced for making sure that you can actually catch some of these errors earlier. We asked a friend, okay, hey, do you know what is typefins? Not really. I only know Java annotations. Is it anywhere related to that, right? The moment these kinds of cycles happen, and when you are really getting stuck at work, where you have 10 other items to attend to, and then you are kind of making these kinds of decisions, it becomes very hard, right? At that point, we said, okay, hey, we'll just like quit Python. We'll move to Java. For all our backend today, we use Java, and then only for scripting we use Python, right? So it was I mean, we had to rewrite some parts of it, but it was okay. But we are glad that we made the decision. But I think for startups, it's going to be very critical that you have access to experts. The other question is, like, in terms of choices, like, do you go for native services or do you go for managed services that the cloud providers provide, right? The question that usually that has helped us is, do we expect a lot of customizations, right? Is our use case vanilla, like plain vanilla thing that most of the other companies would also use? If it is a plain like vanilla use case, the managed services really get you a good, it gives you a lot of advantage because high availability, etc. is automatically taken care. But if you think that this very core component to you, and then you might actually do a lot of customizations, at least from our experience thus far, we found that having our own services were actually much better. Because what happens is typically we go through some of the managed services, and then there were lots of limitations. See, either you should know the managed services in and out. If you have used them in the past, then it is totally okay. Otherwise, you have to read them like an insurance disclaimer to make sure that you go through every single thing. Otherwise, you might miss on certain small things that might actually come back and bite you later. It has definitely happened for us at least couple of times where we had to redo some implementation, at least let's say 3 to 4 weeks of effort because we didn't actually go through the documentation end to end, right? Because they are very easy to start, so you just like tend to start and then miss out on some of these things, right? And also how time tested that particular service is also going to be one of the factors. All right. The next thing, it's high availability, right? Is it actually worth investing in high availability? I'm going to go against wisdom here, and I know I might receive some flake for it, but key question: what is your nature of business? How important is it for you to actually care about high availability? Is it okay for your system to be temporarily down, and will things be fine? How much of a loss is that? That's a key question that we ask ourselves in this case. Okay. And in our case, at least, like let's say that MySQL, we have a transaction issue or something with Kafka going down, Mongo going down, we don't care. Okay. So I know it might be surprising. That doesn't mean we are actually, our users are having a bad time, right? it means that the cost involved in investing in solving some of these problems are better invested elsewhere to solve some of users' most important problems, right? It's always a choice, correct? Here, we found high availability is too expensive for at least for our nature of business. Instead, the way we solve is we invest a lot on recoverability, right? We have a lot of scripts. We have like 50 plus scripts that would just like recover whenever a failure happened. So by doing that, and a lot of our flows are also idempotent flows. So which means if it fails once, it can be called again, things will be smooth at that point, right? By focusing on recoverability more than reliability, we have been able to get away from actually investing heavily in high availability. Okay, so that's actually a very interesting takeaway for us. The other thing is scale, right? Like that is also something you have to keep in mind. A lot of businesses might have a surge of traffic, which they have to handle at which point in time they have to invest or over provision for the peak. Again, there were a couple of options. We could have actually invested heavily to make sure that our systems work amazingly well for peak traffic, but at least for our case, it didn't matter, right? So instead, what we did was we identified the bottleneck flows. If we were to take our example, for example, in our case, lots of people might actually come, especially when we conduct campus events, etc. People might come at once to the platform and then click on enroll for the micro experience, right? So instead of handling that really like in a scalable way, what we instead did was we took the route where we would say, tell the user, okay, hey, you register, but we'll take care of it asynchronously. We'll let you know once it's ready, right? It's okay. It's slightly suboptimal user experience, but as soon as they're onboarded, right, then they have a solid experience. That's what we want to invest more on. The user taking say 15 minutes extra to actually enroll and then start a course is not really a big deal for us, right? So making these kinds of decisions, at least with respect to this, right, not investing heavily in high availability to actually take care of burstiness of our traffic, definitely saved us around like 1 to 2 months of our effort. Right. The next thing is how do we actually time the DevOps investment? I'm very sure that startups would have this question again, right? Here, it's still our learning is still evolving. I wouldn't completely say with conviction that we know everything over here. A lot of learnings for us as well. One thing, at least in our case, is it's definitely based on the nature of business, etc. At least in our case, scale is not a huge factor, and the moment you have a lot of subsystems, it will actually get harder and harder. If you have, let's say, one MySQL server, one REST API server, and then like maybe one more cache or something, it's fairly straightforward. In our case, it was quite a bit. So initially, we had actually chosen to go the manual route just to make sure that everything is working, because we didn't even know what subsystems we would actually need. Right at that point, investing in automation wasn't kind of the right choice. So slowly we started with manual, just like making sure that some of the alerts, etc., are in place. And then now we are actually slowly moving towards automated solutions for that, right? The other key learning for us is you might not have all the expertise in-house for DevOps. So it may be much, and the other thing with DevOps is technology keeps changing very fast, right? People just like come up with new things. It just like changes it's like front end, right? It just like keeps moving very fast. It's very difficult to catch up. So here, that's where we actually felt working with consultants was much more helpful. In fact, AWS provided us with a consultant as well. And that approach works slightly better for us because we get the expert knowledge. They do the initial setup from where you can actually always take up things. Right. That way, you don't have to invest upfront time, because once you get the overall architecture, etc., right, moving on from there, replicating the same setup for other subsystems is slightly easier. That's kind of one of our takeaways as well. So in terms of security, right, I think a good chunk of people, I haven't done any survey per se, but I'm guessing that good chunk of people would have hit crypto mining attacks at some point in time, right? So the learning, at least takeaway for here, is like VPN is a very low hanging fruit. I would say the moment you start the company, maybe a few months down the line, you should definitely get the VPN set up, because it just like hides most of your internal resources out from the outside world, right? It's simply inaccessible. There can be no password attacks, etc. So it's a very low hanging fruit. Please make sure that you do invest in that. Other than that, for security, at least doing a baselining is a better start, right? Rather than just like leaving everything to open, just like do some baselining. Make sure that you know what could be a problem or what might not be a problem. Whether you make investments to fix them upfront is a call that you have to make, but at least know where the loopholes are. And yeah, it's definitely some process that you have to set up. Once the process is set up, even for security, things may move slightly easier, but that initial investment you have to actually make based on the priorities that you have. It also depends on the sensitivity of data you hold, right? For some companies, let's say you are in payment domain, it's very, very critical, or health domain, for example, right? So that also is a very critical factor in deciding when to actually make some of these investments. Right? As Amit was referring to, it's a very, very small team, so you have to be extremely productive and efficient, right? The tech org has to be extremely productive. So what are some of the takeaways we have had in this is, first and foremost, I can't lay enough stress. Unit test and integration test is very, very key. If you want to move fast, if you want to iterate fast, if you want to do a lot of experiments, and if you don't have automated tests, you are in big, big trouble. Okay. Unit tests, like, I think one quick point to mention over here is, like, initially we did a lot of unit testing. We had a lot of unit tests done by the developers, which was very helpful in developing features. We actually missed out on integration tests in the beginning. We didn't really understand the value of integration tests to start with. But what we realized is integration tests are much, much low hanging fruit. It's very easy to set up. Maybe in a week, you can actually set up all the user flow for integration tests. It gives you the confidence before you push something to production. So if at all you are starting to automate, I would say go ahead with integration tests first. Make sure that all the user flows of your product are actually automatically tested, so that you can actually blindly go about pushing your code to production, right? The way unit test has helped us is developer productivity. That's slightly different, right? Where developers can actually iterate really fast. It may be 1.5 times your initial estimate of developing a capability or a feature, but it's actually very much worthwhile in the long run, right? Because you would actually start finding value, say 2 months down the line, when a different developer touches the same code and then makes a change. If it is having unit tests, then you can be very, very sure that that development in the second iteration of development can happen fast. Both needs upfront investment to set up the right things, and it is, if you were to ask us, it's definitely worth every single penny. I know this might not come in, at least for starters, but it's counterintuitive, definitely worth every single penny. And today we have like good amount of coverage for most of our flows as well. The other point mostly gets under the rug is debugging efficiency. That's a good chance that startups work with junior developers. A lot of, like, the pyramid will be slightly skewed towards the lower part of the pyramid, right? And so are we. We have quite a lot of junior developers. And one of the key things is, in the first few time, like when the first few years of their career, you have to be extremely conscious about the productivity, right? How much of time is actually wasted in debugging? If you start tracking that a bit, right, you would actually have some, like, very, very interesting results over there. Typically, we see that 30 to 40% of their time actually gets wasted in debugging. Now, their efficiency cannot just like improve arbitrarily. Your code has to be structured in such a way that it aids debugging, right? It has to be testable code. Only then this can happen really fast. So one simple test that we have is, if we have a code that the developer writes and it takes more than 5 minutes for them to go through the compile test cycle, then something is broken there. You have to definitely fix, because if you were to think of a typical day, I'll show an example, right? We had some component where there is some user input. It goes through some component. It goes through some transformation through Kafka pipeline, and then it goes through Kafka and then does we do some transformation. It gets stored in MySQL. Now, sometimes when during the development, the developer sees some error in the MySQL. Now, what is the way for him to actually fix the problem, right? Then he has to go all the way, simulate the user input, and then go through each of them, which easily takes 30 minutes. 30 minutes is conservative in our case, right? And if you were to take a typical developer day, say 6 hours of productive work, how many such cycles can he have? 12 cycles at max, right? If you were to think of the other case where we have, after fixing something like this, we made sure that the code is testable, the pipeline is testable, which means that an error occurs within 5 minutes, he'll be able to simulate whatever needs to be done from Kafka. The pipeline goes through it, and then we get the output. So the testing cycle is about 5 minutes. The moment you do that, the number of iterations a developer can have, even within an hour, is like 12, right? So it's very critical for you to keep an eye out for this, especially in some areas where your compile test cycle is larger. It's going to be very, very painful development, and the debugging efficiency of the developers is also going to go down a lot. Okay, something you should just like go back and then take a stock at. Very, very useful. The last thing is on resourcing. Here we had some interesting takeaways here. Again, we have to be very, very smart about the amount of money we spend, etc. Right? So what has worked for us is remote interns. We work with a lot of students, and a lot of times the number of remote interns that we have is much, much greater than the in-house tech team strength, right? And you have to be also conscious. We have done some experiments with them to understand what works and what doesn't work. So usually exploratory tasks, they do really well. They learn technology much faster than us actually. Like most of the cases, if you're in your 30s, most likely they are going to learn much, much faster than you because they don't have a unlearn cycle. You have to unlearn and then relearn new things. They're extremely effective there. So you have to just like give some guidance. So we found them to be extremely effective in exploratory tasks, but things that are close to deadlines, you might want to not give them, right? And usually what we try to have a long-term relationship with them. So most of them within few months, we actually were able to get them into a level that they would be able to contribute just like our in-house engineers, right? And it is also a very easy way for us to understand different skill sets because they're slightly, I mean, compared to a full-time job, it's slightly a lesser commitment as well. So you know who works best where, etc. as well, right? The next thing is consultants, working with consultants, as I said, DevOps, any non-core functionality to your company, we usually try to get it done through consultants. And we have tried it for first to start with the integration testing setup, front end, DevOps. We have tried consultants for almost all of these. And one piece of suggestion I have is like make sure that you go through referrals because the experience can be good or extremely bad. Okay, there's a high chance that you might actually end up on one of these areas. So referrals usually work, and it doesn't really go with the proverb that you may know a handful by the whole, right? You mean that doesn't really work here. Okay, so even if one of the engineer in a consulting company is good, because like let's say your friend refers and then he says, hey, I worked with this consulting company and then this engineers were very good, that doesn't represent the whole. So you have to be extremely conscious that on a consistent basis, that particular consulting company is actually giving you good services. This is also a very key takeaway for us. The last thing that Amit discussed, right? Our engineers are really empowered. They're actually given the responsibility to drive products. They're sending surveys asking users whether whatever I built makes sense to you or not, right? See, think of how much they own the product, right? So it has really helped us. Initially, they definitely do make mistakes, but you should give them that cushion. The moment you give them that comfort that they can fail, right? They can take something to the user, fail, then it's an initial investment and a bit of coaching. But what we have seen is like it is really, really satisfactory, both in terms of like personally mentoring somebody as well as in terms of what you get for the company as well. So that's primarily it. Like these are our key takeaways. I mean, if you were to
Sridhar, before you move into the key takeaways, do you want to take a moment and because we are really excited about the platform, do you want to take us through the the demo or a glimpse into the Cryo platform itself?
Sure.
And while Amit and Sridhar is doing that, I would request audience to also post their questions in the Q&A forum. Feel free to ask questions, and we will ask those questions with the founders here. And yes, so yeah, you can go ahead, Amit and Sridhar.
Amit, show us like what we got after doing all those deciding on what.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll actually do a very quick one. I want to leave some time for the audience also. So this is how like our login for the user dashboard looks like. Various micro experiences that she was talking about appears as card and whatever you're registered into. When you open a micro experience, like you are presented with, like a PRD of sorts, like a requirement document of what QBox or this particular product is all about. And we have divided, like the overall work stream into a bunch of modules. Like you go through these modules and then, like you get, like a note from product manager, you read this and then, like what architecture are you going to be solving in, and like what is the objective of those particular tasks. And then everything is divided into a bunch of tasks that users go one by one. And like to do this, I was talking about that ID also, right? Like, so it's right here actually. So I can just click on start machine, and rather than going on a virtual machine, actually the whole ID actually loads in the browser. Takes like a while, but it'll just come up. And while you're coding, right, after you have coded, like you're also running bunch of test cases and all those things. So your assessment of, like how you have written your code and all also comes in here. Like you go through bunch of iterations where you're failing them, and then eventually you pass and, like unlock like a debrief sort of thing for you. And, like this is where we assess them, how it is. Also, in the modules, like integrated help also is in here. Let's say you're stuck with some complex, like task, and you're not able to move forward, then you can always click on, like show hints, and then contextually these hints will be available to you, and then you can unlock them and, like proceed further. So these are, like a bunch of things just to show you how this ID also works. Like this actually spins up the container in cloud for you, and here you can directly start coding based on the tasks that you have. At any point of time when you're stuck, want to understand, what the different part of the interfaces mean, you can always go through, this guided tool to understand where we are. Yeah, this is where we are with the product right now.
Great, thanks, Amit. If you have to take away a few things, right? At least from our learnings, what we found most interesting were that forcing yourself into faster feedback cycle is extremely critical, right? And the other thing is don't just like go out and build, right? Listen to users, understand what is required, do very fast experiments. I think most of it is common sense, but sometimes when you are in thick of things, you tend to miss them, right? If you were to ask somebody and then give a gyan on, okay, how to run a startup, everybody will talk about the same thing. But what we want to highlight is day to day, when you start doing things, you miss out the bigger picture. So just like pay extreme attention to making sure that you're not building things unless you are very convinced that it's required. And experiments, correctly designed experiments, are a great way to actually go about building things. You don't want to run an experiment to just like prove what you think is right. That's also something that you have to keep in mind, right? In terms of how to go about building, one thing that has very much helped us is product aware engineers, right? We try to help them a lot with understanding users and then making sure that they are aware of what's happening. We force them to actually sort of do interactions with users. Some might be initially uncomfortable, but they get into that, right? Like we just like put them in spot. And now all our engineers go through the pulse surveys. They try to understand why I have to do that. Once they get that, the kind of bottom up ideas that come up is something that's like really
that leads to like the organic improvements in our product.
Right. Here, as I showed, like the high availability, right? You may not go with a universal, patterns on how to go about building things. It's completely up to you, right? So you know the business very well. You know where your product stands. You know the expertise of your team. So you have to be consciously making choices instead of just like going by universal laws on what to build. And also efficiency in your team is something you should always keep on top of your mind. How to have a lean team and then still have really solid productivity. So solving for productivity using automated tests, or making sure that your engineers are able to debug things fast, have fast dev deploy cycles, is also very critical based on whatever we have observed so far. All right. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Now we can take some questions, and over to you.
Yep. All right. Thanks so much, Sridhar and Amit. So let's have a look at if we have any questions in the Q&A forum. I think I can already see one of them here. So one of them, basically, it's Gurpreet who has asked this question, is about basically he wants to understand if you're using any kind of event sourcing for your platform, and basically he wants to understand you're using Kafka in this environment, but is there a specific event sourcing platform you're using or a pattern you're using to collect the events?
Sorry, can you help me understand the question again?
Okay, so basically it's about to have more insights on the product development. Okay. Is there an event sourcing method you are using for your platform?
So is it about instrumentation? Just let me take a look at the question as well. Is it about instrumentation, maybe?
Yeah. So basically, I think the perspective is like, how are you collecting events from the product, right? So from when the users are interacting with the product, how are you collecting the events, and so that you can have better insights about the product, right?
Got it.
Sure. So I think like a bunch of events or, like these things which are required. So we have all these events also going in data pipeline. Like that's where we actually capture most of the things. And based on those events is how we orchestrate a lot of experience on our platform also. And, for the top of the funnel and things also, we have like a third party softwares using which we are actually capturing some of the events and orchestrating journeys for the users.
I'm guessing questions like, say, we use tools like, say, Browsy,
Mixpanel
to understand what our user journey is, and then try to understand, okay, what do they do in the product? We have not been like completely on top of some of these things because that's not really a low-hanging fruit for us yet. But we do use some of these tools, at least in terms of some campaigns, etc., to understand, okay, hey, what is the user journey on our product? What do they do? What do they not do? Right? Today, one of the best advantages, we are able to see the users live doing certain things. So, we don't have to derive from metrics alone. We have qualitative data on some of these as well.
So basically, part of that question was that are you using somewhere in this pattern? Is there Kafka helping you out with that? You are basically storing those events, or it's just with the tool itself?
It's mostly with the tool. We don't really Kafka is not useful in this way. We do capture other user behavior on the platform, for which we do capture some of these events and then do analytics on top of it using plain Metabase, etc. That's slightly different. That's part of the core parts of the platform. That's not necessarily user behavior through instrumenting the front end, etc. It's slightly different.
Okay, cool. So I have a few more questions. So questions have started pouring in. So the next question is basically when you talk about not using an HA, right, to offset the cost, and using scripts to recreate the failed systems, how long does it take for the faulty module to be up and running after failure? And what kind of tool are you using for that? Apart from the scripts, are you using some kind of automation tool like Terraform or something to bring those environments up?
Okay, so there are two parts to it. Okay, one, recoverability, and then two, when you know the event happened, right? So usually the recoverability is very fast. All you have to do is run a Python script and then it will start working again. But the key question is, do you know when that problem occurs for the user, right? That's slightly the trickier part. So initially we started with just recovery because we had a lot of control over when users work. So when users worked on our platform, we are not a 24/7 kind of platform, right? We know when typically users work. We have some idea about that, right? There's some sort of a pattern over there. So we are much more focused, say, late during nights that people will work on. So any error at that point, we'll make sure that the on-call takes care of the problem as soon as possible. So after we have the recoverability systems in place, we started investing a bit about proactive alerts, right? Where we start knowing when the user is running into the problem, right? There we are still in progress. So in terms of the whole cycle of recoverability, from the time we detect, recovering is not really a big problem, but detecting is what we are trying to improve upon right now. And we don't really use anything fancy there. It's end of day Python scripts.
Okay. So I think even I had a question around HA. So you mentioned that you took a trade-off on HA, but because you had a very idempotent setup and you had a lot of scripts which did a lot of automation to bring things up, but it is I think it is stack to stack. It depends, right, as to how much of the HA you want to build, how much of the trade-off you want to take, and how much your team is ready to be able to recover those quickly, so it depends on that. You have to take the HA decision. But if the customer SLA is pretty high, and they don't want any kind of such instances, then probably you, what is your thought on that?
Yeah, it's like as I put a disclaimer upfront, it's very much depends on the nature of your business. If you're a company, let's say that you have a mobile platform, like let's say you have a mobile app that's shipped, and then you are actually taking care of your backend, and it's a 24/7 people use your app, then you can't really make these trade-offs, right? You have to definitely make sure that the user actually has a great experience all the time. But you know your users well enough that that's not really the use case. 24/7 is not really the use case. Then you can actually always make these trade-offs. So it's very much dependent on what kind of business you are running, what kind of users are you targeting, and is your platform 24/7 or not.
And just for our cryo case, I would say, like what used to happen earlier also was when some system will go down, right? Like we will actually tell our users who are also developers, like that we are running into something in our backend, and then they will actually empathize, like being a startup, they will know, yeah, this is also a company who's, like going through their journey. So yeah, like it was a good connect with them, like being very honest with them, like you take that trade-off, but then you're also keeping your users informed in terms of, like being very transparent in terms of what is happening with your stacks.
Yeah, developer love is critical. I remember we have done even an RCA. We have showed an RCA to our users.
To our users, yeah.
Suddenly they feel part of the problem. Okay, hey,
Yeah.
How did you do that? Okay, I want to understand this. Let me be like, didn't this work? Didn't this work? Right?
Yeah.
So,
our initial batches actually, students have actually given us so much feedback, right? Like in terms of what features needs to go there, how we can improve it. And that's where, like we made a connect, like we were actually listening to them and trying to actually bring those sort of capabilities into our product also. So that was like a good cycle, like then.
Yep. I think that there are 2 points I can take away from that. Is one is making your customers your part of your family, and second is earning the trust. That's those two very important parts I can see definitely. So from there on, I would move into next questions. So the next question is, how about micro experience on for experienced engineers? Like, are you thinking something about that along those lines?
So, I mean, it's definitely an option that we would always try to expand, right? Like today, our focus is primarily the junior engineers and students. Anywhere between, let's say, somebody starting their college, knows a bit of programming, they can actually have something useful on our platform, and all the way up to, say, 3-4 years of experience, right? And for experienced engineers, we don't have advanced curriculum, but let's say somebody wants to move from one domain to the other. For example, let's say somebody is deep into system side and they want to move to distributed system side, then our platform definitely will suit them. So it's just like the content expansion that we'll do slowly based on market needs.
Yeah, I think I mean, the second part of the question was that let's say the person is an architect and he wants to work, or she wants to work on cutting edge tech stack. So do you have do you support that, or do you have plans for that? So I think part of the question you already.
Sure, yes. But yeah, not right now, because we are also be looking at market factors to see what are the most in demand things, right? Like we look for large number of users, so that's primarily a market driven decision usually.
Right. So next question is basically it's a little tricky question, but the question is about what is the approximate AWS cost, and what are the AWS resources you're using apart from EC2? So yeah, that's another question.
So cost is something that we are still working on. We are trying to understand some of the optimizations that we can potentially do. Just like okay, can we actually do reserved instances? Can we actually make sure that the right type of instances are chosen, like T3 instead of say M families, right? So we are still learning, quite a bit of learning that we have to go through. And some aspects of it also depends on what kind of infrastructure we are using and building, right? In some cases, we are not even clear how much should we upfront commit to as well, right? So those are some of the learnings that we are still having in progress, I would say. And in terms of the AWS technologies we are using, we use Lambdas pretty extensively, and RDS and EKS, right? We are big time into the clustering aspects because all our services are kind of stateless as well. We are trying to make sure that we are able to leverage some of it as well. And because of the need for us to actually scale up and scale down the number of systems that we provide to the users, it's extremely critical that we have that kind of a capability, right? So these are at least some of the things that we use.
Cool. I think with that, you actually also answered one of the next question where someone is asking, are you using RDS? Or actually, Gurpreet is asking, are you using RDS or and are you using MySQL Aurora? It's Postgres. So I think part you have already covered. So yeah, I mean, the other question. So that one of the questions which came in just now that they are seeing Kafka in the slides. Do you use them on AWS? Yeah.
Yeah, we do have our own Kafka cluster in AWS. As I said, like we have 75 plus topics on Kafka, and it just like keeps increasing day by day. That's like, I mean, it has to be put in context to the number of user flows we have actually, right? It's quite a lot compared to the number of key user flows we have in the platform itself.
Right. So even, I don't see any questions here in the Q&A right now, and I think questions are coming in, but while they are coming in, let me ask this question. So when you say that in the Kafka, you have transformations, so do you run some transformations within the cluster, or it's running somewhere outside, in the, once it is stored in the database?
EMR today, we have separate data pipelines that take the data out of Kafka and then do some transformations and then publish it back to MySQL, RDS.
Okay, awesome. While I'm not seeing another question, let me also ask another question, on behalf of our audience. So how do you keep your team motivated? So I've seen that, you have done a lot of things to motivate the developers on the platform. At the same time, how do you keep your team motivated on the entire?
Actually, more than motivation also, right? Like as Sridhar was pointing out to these choices, right? Like whenever we are taking those choices, it's always, like a very, like involved discussion in terms of, like when we were actually making tech choices, or, like when we were deciding in terms of whether we have to use managed services or this, or, like access to expert, as you were saying, like initially that, because most of our engineers also, like are very fresh, like they are highly motivated people, anyways, but, like in terms of when it comes to taking these choices or decisions, those are very important discussions. So doing very rational discussions with them and making them aware about, like what business actually needs today, or what is it that is required for us to actually move faster today, is, like the layer which we try to expose them to, and that has actually yielded like a lot of results for us, like in terms of the ownership that we have seen from them, the accountability that they have, or, like how they are empathizing with users and trying to identify where the problem lies, and, like coming back and then proposing, and then, like we have engineers who will fight for, like those proposals, and we will know, like this is going to be a very long run, like probably sort of a process, but yeah, we still, like we back them up with those ideas, and that has actually get some of good results for the product.
Certainly, it's very inspiring.
Ownership, right? Like how much of ownership they have in the company, and then what kind of decisions do we let them take, right? It's a matter of trust, right? Like if they believe that we trust them, and then we will back them at any cost, they own it and then they do it, right? Motivation comes naturally instead of they doing, okay, hey, do XYZ, I'm done, tick tick tick, right? That never works actually. That's like 9 to 6 job.
That's great. I mean, I'm sure they are getting mentored by true builders here. And so especially when you're part of a company where when the organization is pushing you to take ownership of everything, and then when you give any suggestions and those suggestions actually get aligned into the product itself later on, it's very inspiring for you. That's something, yeah, that's awesome. I have another question which has come in the Q&A. So what is the roadmap of Cryo as a product? Where do you want to take in the end?
Sure. So I think like some of the key, like, see, we are a company in an edtech domain, right? And we are planning to actually disrupt learning. Learning is also, like a very, not a very straightforward problem. So when you're talking about learning, we have to actually understand how learning can happen best for, like tech or software developers. As Sridhar was pointing out earlier, like the medium that it has been, like it has not really changed. People are still doing it through books or, videos or those medium. But what we are trying to do is actually create an environment which is, like best for developers, where they can actually do things and then do it. So some of the key factors, like which are going to be very challenging problem for us to figure out is, like understanding at what point, like a developer is stuck. How are we able to create or, like give them a desirable difficulty in the course that they are going through, really personalizing it, and then providing them just enough help so that, it's not spoon feeding for them, but at the same time, it's good enough for them to push themselves. That's when the true learning will happen. So in terms of, where Cryo is headed, in terms of, what it means for a developer is to give them this experiential learning platform, as we call it, right? Like where this is like a test bed for them, where they can actually learn whatever technologies that they feel comfortably in a safe environment by pushing themselves and moving forward.
I mean,
Awesome.
the easiest way to actually think of where we want to get to is, let's say that you take chess as an example, right? I as a user, I as a player, let's say that I play with a 5-year-old kid. I'll get bored in like 5 minutes because I know that my skill set and the challenge that a 5-year-old will pose to me will be very, very less, right? Like my skill is too high, challenge is too low, I'll get bored, right? If I'm playing with a grandmaster, again, I will actually feel overwhelmed because my skill is low, challenge is too high. How do we strike the right balance through the product to sustain user motivation for a prolonged period of time? Right? That's where we are trying to take the product. So anything that they want to learn, they actually have a very challenging way. It becomes a game for them.
Right.
Awesome. Awesome. So I have another question here. Do you run sprints and retrospective meetings as part of the micro experience as well?
As part of micro
I mean,
experience.
for a learner
Yes.
For the learner.
I think the question is in terms of the learner who is taking the micro experience.
Correct.
Sure.
So the way it is structured itself is kind of close to like a sprint. It's each module you can think of it like a sprint. So the way it is driven is also like a sprint. You take this week you commit to 2 modules that you are supposed to do whatever learning that needs to happen, and then get things done. So typically it mimics exactly what happens at work. So yeah, in terms of what the learner would go through, it will be like weekly goals, targets that they have to meet within certain deadline, and then they have to finish. So it's essentially a sprint.
Yeah, and in terms of validation, I think like we have debriefs inbuilt in our product, right? Like when you're done with, like your coding and pass the assessment, we actually, like there is a debrief where, like you will actually retrospect, like what is it that you have learned in this module, and then you will fill that or you'll go through that solution. And so that, like whatever you have gone through that experience, you are able to actually create a summary out of it and say, yeah, this is what I've sort of learned in this module. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have a couple of more minutes, but let me ask you this question because I've seen this in some platforms. Are you planning to do kind of a one-to-one mentoring as well during these kind of micro experiences or any of the modules which have so once they are ending up with the session, then kind of doing a mentorship as to one-to-one mentorship as to okay, how you can improve further going on from here, what you want to do next?
Okay, so one-to-one mentoring, it's not scalable, right? But however, we do understand that users have that need as well, right? So it depends on, we have multiple offerings for users, and in certain cases, if it is a career-related offering, definitely one-on-one mentoring is required. They need to make choices, career choices. I may want to go in one path or the other. So there, we try to do a bit of one-on-ones as well. But what we try to do is typically, if we were to think of it from the perspective of satisfying users' learning journey, we try to deliver as much as through product. But there are softer touch points which we solve with one-on-ones. Like motivation is something the product cannot do, right? Like I'm overwhelmed for this week. I'm not able to make progress. I have a personal problem. I can't really make progress. We definitely have some one-on-ones to make sure that they're in the right frame of mind.
Right. As part of our experience, also we have like tech leads, like whenever they are actually stuck, like really in terms of understanding a concept or something, they can easily reach out to the tech leads which are assigned for that micro experience, like on Slack and all, and then they can resolve those queries one-on-one also. So that sort of thing is there. But as Sridhar mentioned, in terms of counseling, when you say one-on-one counseling, that actually becomes when like someone is actually going doing, let's say, a career track with us. Like what sort of company do they want to go to and all those things. That's where the one-on-one.
That's awesome, but you have a Slack channel where users can talk to the team leads and so that's pretty good.
Slack has been very good because people post random memes and then they just like make sure that they take along other people. So usually Slack memes are working out pretty good for us.
Awesome. I think we are at the end. So with that, I would like to thank Amit and Sridhar for having such a good conversation here, and I would like to thank audience for being there and asking so many questions. So I can see some more questions in the Q&A, but feel free to post those questions to your story and AWS Builder session, and we will share those questions with the founders here of Cryo, and they'll respond back. So we will pass that question, right? So with that, I would like to thank everyone from the audience, and that's pretty much. Thank you all, and stay safe.